Hi, welcome to the Drew Teach webinar series on the ethics of digital literacy. I'm very excited to have with us tonight Mike Cook and Brandon Sams. So Mike and Brandon, I'm going to turn this webinar over to you and you can explain what your topic, ethics of composing, performing identities in digital spaces, is for everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're looking forward to it. My name is Brandon Sams. I'm an assistant professor of English at Iowa State.
And hi, everyone. I'm Mike Cook. I'm an assistant professor of English education at Auburn University.
Mike and I met a number of years ago. We were colleagues at Auburn at the time. And yeah, we ended up doing a lot of projects together and ended up, since we were in charge of the English Ed program, we did a lot of programmatic design and redesign around the topics of teacher identity and also integrating digital public writing projects through our curriculum. So this chapter kind of comes out of that collaboration and colleagueship. So can everybody hear me okay? And did I share the screen appropriately, Kristen?
Not yet. No, go ahead and hit share again.
Sorry about that.
Now you're shared and you probably just want to go to present.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So our big driving concept is teacher identity. So we thought we would spend a few minutes at the beginning talking about why we think teacher identity is so important in teacher preparation. In our experience, a lot of our students, not all of them, but a lot of them come to us with some cultural scripts about identity that can be, sometimes they can be empowering, but also sometimes they can be limiting. Since we're both English educators, we find that often our students come to us with a firm conviction that they love literature and that their main duty as an English teacher is to impart that love of literature to their students. And while that script of identity isn't uniformly negative, it can also lead to some disillusionment. It can prop up whiteness and classism as well. And it can really circumscribe the literacies that students bring with them into the classroom. So part of what we want to do as teacher educators is to help students transition from thinking and feeling like a student to thinking and feeling like a teacher. And interrupting some of these scripts, we think, is part of that work. So, you know, broadly speaking, we would like our students to become a kind of teacher who is a lover of justice and a lover of equality and wants to use their classroom to, I guess, as a transformative space. Another kind of complicating narrative is education reform. So I'm not sure exactly what New Jersey is, if it's an EdTPA state or a PPAT state, but those are giant reform movements that really shape implicitly and explicitly what our students come to think that teaching is. And we feel like that's another limiting script that limits their attention to justice, social justice, and transformation. So that's kind of part of our bigger question about teacher identity. Mike, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll say so yes to everything that Brandon said, and I'll also just to drill into I guess individual teachers. We think of, I guess, identity as this sort of developmental construct. So it's not, teaching is never this like space of becoming that we get to, right? We're always throughout our career evolving as teachers, better understanding who we are in our context. How those things work together to shape us as teachers. So we believe in making that really central to the work we do with pre-service teachers. If we expect folks to not see graduation as that moment of now I am the teacher that I'm going to be. The difference, I think, is that we stop paying tuition and we begin getting a paycheck, but we're still constantly learning and growing, you know, every day, every month, every year. So all of our projects are sort of at helping students to reflect and think about themselves in the moment in relation to where they've been, and in the moment in relation to where they view themselves going. And I think we'll add quite a bit more as we roll through. So we'll try not to belabor our love of talking about teacher identity. So I think to get us started, I wanted to kind of begin with a question. So I'm going to ask you to take about 30 seconds, and you can think around this or write around this, whatever is most comfortable to you. But the question is, how does your teacher education program facilitate your identity development as a teacher? So what identities are explicitly and or implicitly encouraged? Take about a half a minute and think right through that. I suspect this is a question that could sort of elicit years of thinking, but so 30 seconds doesn't necessarily do it justice, but I'm interested in seeing if we can get a mini discussion going. If anyone's brave enough to jump up and share what they thought about or wrote about, how you're experiencing teacher education as part of this identity development.
Hi, so I am a student teacher at Drew. I'm teaching US and world history for high school freshmen and juniors. And I know that throughout my process with Drew Teach and the MAT program, it's taught me to be very intentional with how I talk about history and making sure I include histories that aren't often mentioned in class, and being a more global teacher, having that mindset, and then teaching the students to then be more global citizens. And that's in the classroom and then in a digital space, wherever I can.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. I appreciate that idea of thinking about history as pluralistic and not singular. And I think you bring up an interesting point about how the ways we develop as a teacher are not just about us, but the students that we're working with, the context that we're working in, I think also help to shape like how we see ourselves as educators and how we view just, the concept of education as a whole. Anyone else interested in sharing?
Similarly to Michael, I am also in high school social studies. I have all US classes. And I feel like my idea of my teacher identity, I wanted to come in and just inspire everybody to love history, and that didn't happen, obviously. I'm a first year and they don't want to always be there. But so it made me have to re-challenge okay, how do I want to get them to put their hands on it and not just love it as much as I do naturally, because they sometimes just want to get a good grade.
I think that's a fair point. And first, we appreciate the passion you bring to teaching, so thanks for that. And I'd love to tell you that in year 2, now everyone automatically will love any subject that you teach them. I'm in year 15, and I'm still working on trying to figure out how to get everybody on board with things. But I love that you're rethinking about how and why someone has to approach history. Hopefully some of that will plant a seed and will blossom into, if not love, at least, some serious interest in it. Thanks for sharing. Time for one more, if anybody else is interested.
My name's Julia. I'm a high school theater teacher, student teacher. And for me, kind of similar to Jesse, I want to be there and show how much I love theater and hope that it inspires a love for telling stories and for being able to communicate and share with one another in an artistic way. I'm lucky in that at high school, it's normally an elective class. So a lot of kids who are in my classes are already interested in it. But I do get those that aren't. The thing that I learned with my identity coming in is that finding the balance between the fun and the fun side of theater, and then the more structured side of theater was really important with figuring out an identity there. And then also when it came to a lot of stuff with, I think, theater education in the arts perspective does not totally align with, teaching a math class or a science class and the way the standards are designed for classes like that. So like learning how to incorporate more and how to create more intercurriculum connections so that I could establish connections with their other classes to get better involvement from students and also keep their learning going all around and keep theater involved in their lives has been a really big part of how I've been identifying as a teacher. I don't think I would have been able to do that without being at Drew because I would have just leaned into the, oh, theater. Okay, cool. So we're going to just do like Uta Hagen this semester and we'll read like these 3 great American plays. And now I like really do think more about incorporating everything together like a kind of like a sewn picture.
Nice. I think you basically should have had a chapter in a book on teacher identity. Like all the things you said there, I think are awesome. You're thinking about outside of standards, using creativity and finding ways to make your curriculum relevant, interesting. And you even talked about how to make it span across disciplines, which I think is awesome. There's a clear appreciation for it. And the last thing I'm going to say, you at first called yourself a teacher and corrected yourself. I think it's perfectly fine for you to call yourself a teacher. You are one right now. You just are in that weird space of having to pay like tuition to do it rather than collecting a paycheck. But it's all right to own that, by the way.
Thank you.
I appreciate everyone sharing. We have a few other questions sort of spaced throughout, so we'll give everybody opportunity to chime in. Brandon, whenever you're ready.
Thank y'all. These responses are fantastic. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. Discussion question 2 is related to identity development, but as teachers and pre-service teachers, what obstacles might stall or have stalled your identity development? So can you think of any from this semester or past semesters? And I guess a follow-up to that would be, how did you address that obstacle, or have you? Are you still wrestling with it and working with it?
I had a situation where I wrote in the comments, and I really enjoy the social justice bent at Drew and things like the Teaching Tolerance Project, like Michael was talking about the multiple histories. But I've run into a situation several times where the teachers who were a little older, like at my school, are not as prepared to dive into that.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't agree with it. It's that they're very concerned about, and I think this came up in a previous session, actually, they're very concerned about offending somebody or getting in trouble with a supervisor or a parent as you have difficult conversations about slavery, about xenophobia, whatever it may be. And so obviously as a student teacher, it's not my classroom. I'm not gonna push too hard against that. Obviously it's not my place, but it's her classroom. But I've kind of heard that perspective of like, let's not do it a couple different times from teachers who maybe aren't aware or weren't schooled in things like teaching tolerance or the social justice teaching standard, things like that.
Does anyone have a response to, is your name Glenna? I'm sorry. Okay. Yep. Does anyone have a response or follow-up to Glenna and these moments of tension between maybe how you've been trained or how you feel your commitments as a person and teacher, courtesy of Drew's program versus some ideologies or stances that might be in conflict with that in your field placement? Does anyone want to follow up with that?
So I've talked a lot about how I've been given a lot of freedom in my placement. My co-teacher is very open with me having to take over and being a real air quote teacher that really practices and gets the real experience. But on the flip hand, sometimes it's hard to then have all the things I have in practice in the moment because I'm really completely in the moment and I'm a new teacher. So I'll have moments I learned how to do this, but this moment is just like, it's happening very fast.
I totally get that. Yeah. You feel like you have the tools and then the kind of the performative urgency. Yeah. I've been there. I feel like Well, it seems like you have in Drew Teach in this community, you have a supportive community to process those moments of saying the wrong thing or not doing the right thing, that is right, or maybe a better path. So I think continue to use this space to process those moments and to strategize about what you'll do when the next moment strikes, I guess.
I found that I sometimes come up with against teachers who have just been teaching for like 20 years and they're
Yeah.
kind of set in their ways. Um, and I get along, for example, like I love my CT, and she's really great. But she's also been teaching for like 30 years and runs her program like a ship. And like when I come in to do things, it's almost like when I started there, she has not adjusted at all to me, which she doesn't have to. It's just, and she doesn't have a problem with how I teach things. It's just for the kids, I think it comes off as kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde, because like our classrooms are quite different. I've merged more because I am used to teachers like her. She's the kind of teacher that I loved having growing up, but she's not necessarily like the most, oh, okay, here's the standard that we're aligned to today, and here's the this, and then this is the actual solid lesson plan we're looking at. It's more like loose stuff like that. So learning how to adjust with all of that has been like one of the obstacles I've come up, and also wondering like, okay, well, she's really good at her job, and I think she's, the kids love her. She gets a lot out of her. She's done really well. She's very successful. Am I like forming the identity I'm forming? Is it falling between these two things I really like, or is it leaning more into one or the other? And there's almost like being between two magnets. And I feel like I need to be in the middle, but sometimes I lean away because I feel pulled to doing the quote right thing.
Yeah. My response to that would be get used to being in motion. And maybe between two magnets and being in tension is the place to be. And if you're at one pole or the other, then maybe you stopped learning. I know that's easier to say. It's easy for me to say, but I wonder if you could think of that wobble as a productive space.
It's also a really nice metaphor or analogy for thinking about.
Yeah.
So I'll add one thing. I think teacher identity is sort of a spectrum, and we don't necessarily just go one direction. I think we're sort of ebbing and flowing. Brandon mentioned that idea of kind of wobbling. I think we step back, we step ahead, we step back, we step ahead. I think that's sort of part of it. Whichever magnet is a bit stronger at the time tends to be pulling us in their way. So maybe part of that is figuring out what those magnets are and how we can kind of like position ourselves to be pulled in by the one we find ourselves attracted to the most, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
it does.
Responses to the obstacles question.
I was wondering if I could just jump in quickly.
Oh, sure.
So I've just been listening, and it's an interesting thing to hear both of the different spectrums here. I'm sort of mid-career teacher, and one of the thoughts I had was it's interesting because when I come up against what Glenna was bringing up about teachers who are a little older in the discipline who maybe are struggling with thinking of the different ways to present information for fear or whatever. I'm not quite there, but at the same time, I've had enough years where I feel comfortable pushing back slightly. But I guess in terms of the obstacles, one of the thoughts I had was sometimes you enter into departments and just by nature of the way those departments function and your need to be part of that community, you don't necessarily get to, if you're new especially, you don't get to really do all the things you want to do. You want to play part of the way that the department works and find your groove within that department. And that can leave, I think, a little bit of a void in, at least that's what the experience I'm having, leave a little bit of void in like what I want to
Mm.
learn about and what I want to be able to bring to my students. So one of the obstacles that I think I've encountered is just being able to try ways of communicating outside of my classroom with my students. It's not typically the norm in like a very traditional English department, which is fine. It's just that that seems to be like an avenue that I find really interesting. And I teach a lot of ESL students, and I think it's really useful for them. And so one of the ways that I've overcome that obstacle is I've reached outside of my department for professional development trainings, things like this, opportunities to get involved in communities with outside of my like department, my hallway. And it got me thinking about the students as we talk about our own like identity building and how important it is to teach them that in our classroom, there are ways that we all have to communicate and operate together, but that there's also an importance that they learn that they can reach outside of our classroom for the things that they need to nurture their own learning and their own desires, and their own identity.
That was well said.
Thank you. Thanks.
Um, yeah, thank you all for your contributions to the obstacles and for thinking about how to live with or work with the tension that those might cause. I appreciate that. Let's see, Mike, I'm sorry. There we go.
Okay. So we've talked a good bit about teacher identity, and you've read the chapter, so you know that we talk a lot about teacher identity in relation to digital public writing. So like, here's the pivot to talking a bit more about that. So we talk about teacher identity first because we think it's sort of at the heart of all that we do as teacher educators. But we've been playing around with digital public writing as ways to help foster and facilitate quite a bit of that. So the bulk of the rest of the presentation will be more closely aligned with the chapter that you read. So we do believe that digital public writing is one way to help students, to help pre-service teachers sort of find their place along that teacher identity spectrum and continue to grow. You know, for example, as teachers continue to contribute to communities of teachers, whether that be on Twitter, through blogs, through whatever they're working on, kind of establishing voice, they're developing, you know, credibility, they're becoming experts and not just taking from the field, but contributing to the field. We think that's really, really powerful. And so as part of that, they're forming and constantly reforming those identities as people within the discipline rather than people inside of a classroom looking out at the discipline. We think that, you know, the types of digital writing that we do, and we really just shared a couple of examples in the chapter we do, and we've done a number of other things, offers our pre-service teachers opportunity to kind of extend their learning, extend their reach. We tend to teach our methods courses in a classroom on a university campus quite separate from a K-12 setting. And so in some ways it feels really inauthentic. We send them off campus to go experience classrooms. 2 or 3 days later, we come back together and try to debrief a little bit when it's no longer fresh, and it's no longer quite as timely as it was. This creates sort of an opportunity to step out there and extend learning beyond our 4 walls, the time constraints of our classroom. And we'll talk a bit about how we think it helps them as pre-service teachers to sort of reposition and re-see themselves as contributing to disciplinary discourse and to the field. We feel like this is one way to help them position themselves as experts and have something to say and something to contribute. And it really opens up opportunities for mentorship beyond people like me and Brandon, right? We love our jobs. We like to think we have a lot to offer our students, but what we have to offer is only what we have to offer, right? Our own experiences. I teach most of my students probably 3 times before they graduate, so they get a lot of me. And they don't often get to interact with a lot of other educators, a lot of classroom teachers, aside from field placements and things. So this creates opportunities for them to step out into the world, digitally speaking, soliciting advice, asking questions, borrowing ideas, engaging in discussion with classroom teachers across the country, which I think offers a lot of potential power. So we're going to talk about some of our own obstacles a little bit. I can't see Brandon's screen, so I'm going to assume that the slide is changing along with me. So someone stop me if it's
I
not.
switched to obstacles. Yeah.
That's why we work well together. You can read my mind. So we asked you a little bit about obstacles, and we want to talk about some that we think we're experiencing and with our pre-service teachers. And we're seeing a lot of similar things across our pre-service teachers at 2 different institutions, at different areas of the country. So we feel like there's something maybe here. So in our experience, pre-service teachers often struggle to see themselves as experts, right? You may have said this yourself. I heard someone say it like, I'm not sure I have anything to contribute to the discussion because I'm not a teacher yet, right? So if you've said that, then you can sort of mentally agree. I hear that constantly, and I struggle with it. I'm like, you have lots to share. If anything, like, you're the voices we need to hear the most of. They can often feel intimidated by digital public writing. You may have experienced this too. Putting themselves out there, being vulnerable, letting the world see who they are and all of their knowledge and all of their imperfections. I think that could be a really scary place to live, especially as a pre-service teacher. They often feel like imposters when engaging with professional community. So mine will maybe be on a Twitter chat and they just want to lurk. Like, I just want to listen and borrow from all the great ideas. I don't really have anything to contribute. I don't think they feel like they belong as a person actually contributing to the conversation. And we think that they struggle to understand the link between professionalization and identity. And what we mean by that is this idea that becoming a teacher is not really just about graduating or obtaining a state credential, a teaching license, a teaching certificate, but it's really about the process of thinking and feeling like a teacher over time. So those are just 4 sort of challenges that we think our students, our pre-service teachers struggle with regularly, and that we've tried to design some assignments to help them sort of navigate part of that world.
Thanks, Mike. That was helpful. Just a brief recap of our chapter. We designed digital public writing assignments that we think address the risks of digital public writing that we described earlier. The 2 that we described in the chapter are the cohort e-portfolio and the Writing as Activism project. And then in the context of talking about those assignments, we offered 3 solutions to the dilemmas of digital public writing. And those 3, just as a reminder, were starting and sustaining conversations about identity, performing professional identity in digital spaces, and finally learning from networks of digital mentors. So we feel like those 3 solutions served as a scaffold for our students as they engaged in these semester-long projects, excuse me, about identity and digital public writing as well.
I think quickly it might be helpful to just note and point out that we have solutions in quotation marks, because we don't
for sure
want to suggest that these are the ways that we solve all these problems. They've been reasonably successful in helping students navigate some, but not 100% successful across the board. They themselves bring a number of other obstacles along with them, which makes sense for teaching and learning, right? Solve one problem creates another problem. So the first one was the cohort e-portfolio. We're just going to do a brief kind of overview to remind you of what you read about, without feeling like you read it for no reason, because we went back through the entire chapter all over again. So with my students, I've done a cohort e-portfolio. This dates back to when Brandon and I worked together. In fact, he came to class and participated in quite a bit of this. But the overall goal really is to try to help my pre-service teachers practice critical reflection, which we think is key to teacher identity development, to develop as multimodal communicators. So they're thinking about communication in ways other than traditional alphabetic texts, to begin crafting professional identities, and for that to be sort of iterative in nature, where they continue to return to it and change it as they see changes in themselves, and to consider important ethical questions and issues associated with digital public writing, with co-creation, and with online representation, specifically for educators, because I know that's a really challenging concept.
Yeah, and just as a brief reminder, I talked about the Writing is Activism project. I use this assignment in a Theories and Methods of Teaching Writing course. And what I want my students to do, ideally, is to learn about the teaching of writing in the context of their authentic composing. So the basic idea was students would get in groups and choose a local, state, community issue or an issue related to education that could in some way be addressed through writing. And so they designed a semester-long project that in some way used digital public writing to address an issue or problem. One group from one semester addressed the whiteness of ELA curriculum in the state of Iowa. And so they kept a semester-long blog that was supported by research and commentary and opinions. And they sent that blog out to their network of digital mentors to get feedback, and also the other English ed majors on our campus for feedback. So I guess a question for any piece of writing, especially in this context, is what work does my piece of writing do in the world? And I know one of you had a good question about that. Like, what's the point, or what does it survive beyond the class? That's a good question and a hard question. But in the process of thinking about audiences and thinking about real world issues that face teachers or schools and communities, I think the identity question or the identity issue began to form. So we can talk about that in detail if you'd like later. Or now. Do you have any questions about the two projects so far, or would you like more details about them? It's okay if the answer is no. Okay.
It also might just be because it's like a Tuesday in the middle of March. I
Oh
apologize.
yeah, for sure.
I'm sure a lot of people's brains are like melty. This is actually very interesting.
No need to
Oh,
apologize.
thanks.
We get it.
I get the brain melt. Yeah, that's a thing.
Either way, I'm proud we practiced our wait time really well there. That's part of my development, that I'm not always great.
Yeah, me too.
And I voice this to my students constantly, that
Yeah.
even though I know we're supposed to wait and supposed to give students time to wrestle with some of these things, that initial silence like suggests a lot of ridiculous things to me, and I have to battle that off. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about some of those solutions that we talked about, just really kind of brief overviews to remind you of what you read about. So the first one Brendan mentioned was starting and sustaining conversations about identity, which is important, right? If we're going to engage in this this growth across the entirety of our careers, like we've got to start some discussions around it, begin to understand it, and then let those conversations sustain. We only talk about it early on. We suggest to pre-service teachers that the identity development takes place in teacher education and then ends the moment the university president hands you your diploma and shakes your hand. And we're trying to sort of avoid that way of thinking. So these are about ongoing conversations about identity throughout the semester, and in a perfect world beyond, as all the classes sort of weave together nicely. Support students as they examine who they are, what they care about, how to represent their identities on digital platforms. And we've listed some questions that we posed to students. These specific ones were from the first set are from Cordy Portfolio, and the second two questions are from Brandon's activism project. We treat them sort of like essential questions that students can continue to come back to and alter their answer as they learn more about themselves and what they're doing as writers. It's about conversations about identity, and that those are vital components of the digital composing process. So to be able to compose themselves effectively, they have to have conversations about who they are, both as students on campus and in the digital world. And then we posed the question, how will your values and identities be written, performed, or concealed in your digital professional writing? And again, that's another big question that students can continue to return to. But I think it does a nice job of weaving in not just identities, but what role values, beliefs, positions, experiences all play in this, and that there's a relationship between what we write, what we're performing, and what we're not saying explicitly, that those things that we keep concealed about who we are.
Thanks, Mike. That was helpful. The second strategy is performing professional identity in digital space. I think ideally there would be the word practice in this strategy. So we want to help students practice doing their identity, professional identity online in smaller, lower stakes ways throughout the semester. And we hope that that lower stakes work translates to the digital writing projects that they're completing in any one class. So one thing that we ask them to do is create a professional Twitter account and participate in virtual English teacher communities. Both Mike and I have a program hashtag, and in the past we've done regular program chats, Twitter chats. I know, Mike, I think you did one last night, if I'm not mistaken. So we want students to participate in a virtual community where they can lean on each other for support and encouragement. But we also want them to participate in larger professional chats like NCTE chat. There are several others that we give them a list of chats and when they are, and we ask them to participate in a certain number during the semester. And some students can lurk on there and not do a whole lot of participating, but we also feel like that's a gradual entryway into participating as a fellow teacher. And I'll never forget one student, it was a virtual, I think it was an NCTE chat, I believe. And she announced her presence to other practicing English teachers. And this student, I think it was a junior at the time. And a teacher asked her on Twitter, "Where do you teach?" And of course her answer was, I'm just a student, in air quotes. But it was that moment of like misrecognition, of being misrecognized as a teacher, that actually she found very encouraging. And so it's small moments like that that we think build professionalism and build membership in a community. Real quickly, since Paul Thomas was the speaker last week, we read education blogs of people who have a critical activist bent, and one of them is Paul Thomas's Radical Eyes for Equity. And we're reading for content there, but we're also thinking critically about how are these teachers, what digital persona are these teachers doing or performing in this digital space, and how are they accomplishing that through their choices of words, through the content that they write about, through the images they select. So we feel like that work, it shows them that teachers can be, they can do public advocacy work and take stances on issues and obviously have opinions about things. But it also translates to their own digital projects, we hope, throughout the semester.
All right, and so the third sort of solution that we talked about was learning from a network of digital mentors, which I think is really important, right? The more mentors we have as educators and as human beings, I think the better position we are to grow and to reflect and to improve in whatever our craft happens to be. So the goal here is we want our students to create and sustain a professional network of support throughout their undergraduate education, and then take that with them into their teaching careers. And Brandon mentioned things like how we use Twitter as a way to go about doing that. My program does 3 Twitter chats per semester. And one of the things that I've been fortunate is that previous students tend to come and join us. So we end up with a number of practicing teachers and occasionally the teacher educator, Shelby Whitty from Oklahoma State, jumped in and joined us for a while last night, which I thought was pretty cool. And that's a person they wouldn't have access to having conversations about. And our Twitter chat last night was on teacher identity development. So that was a really cool moment for them to get that from others outside of just hearing the same things from me regularly. So throughout this, it sort of underlines the learning potential of what we call digital sketch assignments, and so any assignment that's kind of open-ended in nature and helps them to question who they are in given moments. So like the cohort portfolio and the writing as activism projects. Brandon mentioned that our students are using hashtags to request feedback on both of these projects and other things. It's gotten to the point where in class and we'll ask a question and say, never mind, I'll just ask Twitter, and they'll send it out and then they'll report back 30 minutes later or so once someone's responded. They're receiving feedback from the virtual English teaching community, which is amazing. I wish I'd had that opportunity when I was in school. Students learn from and contribute to professional conversations, so they are serving as both students and experts simultaneously. And that the participation and learning contributes to their identity development. That's something that we hope they carry with them, not just into their classroom, but throughout their careers.
Any comments or questions about our approach?
So we're having a very lively chat going on in the back channel. But one thing I think maybe you could help articulate is the concept of the e-portfolio, or I think being on Twitter is becoming more understandable why we would do that, to connect with people, to talk real time, to get ideas, to look at a hashtag, to get ideas after the fact, maybe not in real time. But this concept of the e-portfolio, or putting, your work out there, why would a teacher or a pre-service teacher want to do that?
Okay, I think that's a fair question. I'll do my best to try to answer it. And Brandon can jump in because he was actually doing e-portfolio at Auburn before I came to Auburn. So the e-portfolio itself is this sort of reflective document that's meant to give students from all areas across the university an opportunity to sort of reflect on their experiences and represent who they are. In essence, it often becomes parts of like job search materials. So here, it's a chance, the cohort e-portfolio is again collaborative, so it's about the students I'm working with are in my teaching writing course, their first semester juniors, so it's generally their first semester in the program, first semester with one another, and the first semester with me. So before I ask them to try to go online and create pieces of themselves, which I think is a really scary thing, we do this together for a few different reasons. One, it creates some safety in numbers. But two, it creates some really cool opportunities to just have conversations about who we are. So we have lengthy, and I get responses on my course evaluations for how long some of these conversations last. Surprise students think they last too long quite often. But to really get them thinking about who are we, not just as individuals, but as a group of people here at Auburn majoring in ELA in this time, in this moment. I'm trying to keep myself from trailing off and clearly answering your question. It's really community building, but it also is a very scaffolded way to figure out who we are as a group and present ourselves that way before they then take the experiences they learn designing together, and through the rest of the program, they design their own e-portfolio that does then become part of their resume when they're looking for jobs. We get comments from principals regularly that those e-portfolios that they've created across coursework after doing the cohort e-portfolio are one of the things that made them stand out among a stack of 100 applications. That means a lot. It's not abnormal to have a student reach out after they've graduated and gotten to the program and said, if you cancel anything in the program, make sure it's not the cohort e-portfolio. We realize we complain quite a bit, but that was the thing that really helped us to understand who we were and position ourselves as teachers. They felt pretty confident about who they were as teachers stepping out into the job market because they had created pieces of themselves out for digital public audiences and had multiple opportunities to get feedback and to reflect on that. I hope that answered the question reasonably well.
I have a question. Are there like specific components that you require them to have in the e-portfolio?
That's a good question. Well, we negotiate that together. So the first one we did, we kind of figured this all out from the beginning, and then every previous cohort e-portfolio becomes a mentor text for the next year group of students. So we treat those things like mentor texts. We analyze them, we critique them, we talk about what we think they've done really well, what areas we want to borrow. So generally, it has to represent us as a group of ELA teachers for the world. We also talk about how do we represent our learning across this course. And at that point, it was a multimodal composition focused course. So they have debates on, do we try to show everybody's work? Do we vote on exemplars? Do we only show some assignments? They end up sharing resources for people who might be interested in learning more about the work that they do. So there's usually a page with the books that they're reading, additional articles and texts, graphic novels and things that they think would help future pre-service teachers to move through. And then there's generally some version of kind of who we are, what we do and what we believe in. It's named in some different ways, but I try to nudge them a little bit those ways because I think those require some reflection and for them to begin to articulate clearly how they're seeing themselves at that moment. I think those were both great questions. Any others?
Yeah, they were.
Okay, well then we can.
Yeah, you want to move
I
on?
think we're getting closer to the end. It's easier on us because we're on Central Time, so it's only 7:17 here. So I'm not sure why everybody looks so tired. It's still early. It was my bad joke for the night. Thanks for playing along. So when we think about this idea of composing identities, we're sort of arguing that when students are having sustained conversations about this, when they're practicing, and that's a word Brandon used earlier that I really think is important, practice performing these digital professional identities, when they have opportunities to learn from digital mentors from others outside of the program, they're more likely to engage in future digital composing, becoming experts in digital forums themselves, and they're more engage in issues and processes like ethical literacy, critical reflection, identity creation, all those things that we find vital. I will note really quickly that I think that ethical piece is one thing that I can weave into the cohort e-portfolio really nicely because we include lots of pictures of ourselves. We have tons of discussions about like, how do we do that? What can we share if we don't have everybody's permission and buy-in? So there's a lot of negotiating that goes on, this idea of like representation and what we as individual human beings have the right to like share about other people or of other people. And that's been some of maybe the most productive and like anger inducing conversations that have turned into something really useful in the end.
Well, this is more reflection stuff, so we can, if somebody has a question or an idea that you want to talk more about, we can do that quickly. I know that we're approaching the end here.
I would be really interested to hear like the thoughts of other arts teachers in other venues with this, because like we talk about identity so much in the arts. It's like it's not weirdly, but it's just like a really big part of it. Like, who are you? What is your truth? What is your honesty? And we start introducing that idea of identity. And I like have been trying to think about, since you brought up like the e-portfolios and stuff like that, like how to incorporate my fields more into it. I'm still thinking about it, but I just wanted to say like I thought that was really interesting and like got me thinking.
I really liked that, the questions that artists might pose to themselves about identity. What is my truth? Yeah, I wonder if teachers of English or history ask themselves that same question. I just thought it was very powerful.
Just to follow up on that, Julia, I know that my 7th grade daughter in her art class is basically creating an e-portfolio. So all of the work that they do is captured in some digital format and then put together with this idea of who am I as an artist. So when I think about theater, which I know is what your art is, I wonder how your students could do that same kind of thing. Like it might not be a digital creation, but whatever they are creating, can it be captured digitally for the purposes of reflection and thinking about who they are as an artist and how they are growing and what their artistic identity is developing into. So just keep thinking about that, because I think there is some real power in those questions.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So I'm in my 7th year of teaching, and part of the reason I've started my MED is that I kind of like woke up in my teaching one day and was like, who am I? What am I doing? Because there are lots of moments where you're just trying to kind of get through. Like right now, you know, I have 2 weeks till spring break. You know, it's all about keeping calm. But I just was wondering if you have any advice for practicing teachers, because I can only get so many master's degrees. And, you know, keeping that sort of reflective practice going when there's not a ton of time, or you're, you know, it's definitely a hard thing to fit in, but I think it's super valuable. So I don't know if you have any advice about that.
I think I get that feeling lost in a current feeling, for sure. When I was a high school teacher and now, I'll just tell you what I do. This is very specific. For the last few months, I've been reading, I'll either read a poem every morning to keep me attached to beautiful language and or non-instrumental communication, and that keeps me inspired and grounded. And that sounds a little bit corny when I say it out loud, but I really feel it and mean it. And then Natalie Goldberg is a writer who writes about writing and also practices Zen Buddhism. And she has 2 books that are just beautiful. The one that she's most well known for is Writing Down the Bones. And the second one is sort of a sequel to that. It's called Wild Mind. And the books are a collection of short aphoristic chapters. They take maybe, 4 to 5 minutes to read. But basically all of the entries are about being still and listening to yourself and trying to find yourself in the noise, and also to confront your fear, whatever those may be. And I think when I feel lost in the current, part of it is to do with time and feeling busy, but also it's like there's a little bit of fear there too, because I fear that I'm losing myself in the current, if you will, and I need to locate myself. So those are just some very specific things that I do. So hopefully some of that resonates with you.
Definitely. Thank you.
I'll try to add a little bit. I'm not sure I can say it as eloquently as Brandon did there, but one, like, I think we're all in that space, whether it's 2 weeks away from spring break or not. So one thing that's helped is just to like acknowledge that's the space that I'm going to inhabit. It seems like constantly. I wish I had more time to read, because I think reading is a reflective act. So, I mean, I'm not inventing anything new, but all of those sort of education related texts that I don't have time to read, I'll listen to while I'm driving, while I'm walking across campus every day. So it builds in reading time when I don't have time to sit down and look at the words on the page. I also set aside time for meditation every day, and I make it a part of every course that I teach. So my students have bought in and keeping meditation journals. So even if it's 3 minutes and then 2 quick minutes to just sort of respond after the fact, it's 5 minutes out of my day, right? And sometimes it seems like it's hard to like pull 5 minutes out of a day, but I find that if I make time for that, that creates a space to sort of clear the mechanism, and think about where I am in relation to what's happened and where I'm going. So those are 2 really useful ones for me. In a perfect world, we have time just to go out into the woods every day and walk for an hour or something, right? But it's difficult when we're at work for 12 hours a day, and then families and grading papers and lesson planning and all. So I hope there's something in there, but I'm telling you that the moment I finally bought into listening to audiobooks, I think I got an email from Audible in December telling me I listened to like 37 in 2019. So like, I'm telling you, that is a thing that I make myself do every day.
That's awesome. And maybe actually a really good distraction from, depressing news lately would
Yeah.
be to listen to it in the car instead of NPR sometimes.
Yeah, sure. That was a great question. Thanks so much for asking that. So in the brief time we have left, I want to shift gears just slightly to kind of talk about how Brandon and I are constantly in our search for teacher identity development too. So we've made some changes to our programs, and we thought it might be worth mentioning this. So we wrote about these things. We've done them quite a bit, and we've kind of stopped doing them for some different reasons. We want to really quickly talk about that. So the cohort e-portfolio is no longer a thing in my program, and it broke my heart to drop it. But making room for it in our program was becoming increasingly difficult. Making room for it in a course that was also sort of tasked with preparing teachers to be teachers of writing also felt really difficult. We had some program changes. Brandon took another position. I spent some time, doing two people's work myself, and then bringing in a new faculty member who is wonderful, but this just isn't an area that he has a lot of experience in or a ton of interest in. So it creates some gaps. And I think if it can't be done across the program, I'm not sure it does the same thing or the same things. We're sort of shifting the English Ed curriculum here for a variety of reasons, whether it's for accreditation or college level stuff. And, I'm constantly thinking about how do I meet my students where they are and where they need to be. And I've sort of erred on the side of more opportunity in classrooms. So I teach a course out in a local high school, which also it's not digital, but now they're with teachers for a nice chunk of the day. But we wanted to be just really transparent that while we believe in these things for a variety of reasons, we've had to make some tweaks to what we do.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. The Writing as Activism project, as I described it in the chapter, has also changed. There was one semester in the particular where my teaching evaluations were very low. And the complaints were about the Writing as Activism project, that it was too vague, it was too open-ended, it was pointless, it was useless. And that was painful for me to read. But I felt so institutionally vulnerable because teaching evals are very important at Iowa State, and they, for better or worse, it's mostly just about the numbers. So where do you score on 1 to 5? And the closer to 5 you are, the better. So I'm still conflicted about what I did, but I changed it. I made it less open-ended. I made it more about instructional design. So they are picking a social issue and taking an activist stance on it in a way, but they're mostly designing lessons around said issue instead of engaging in their own writing. And of course, my evals the next time around were very high. So I struggle with the fact that institutionally I'm being marked or read as a better teacher and a better teacher of writing. And students, when they fill out the evals, they feel like they've learned more, but I wonder if they have. So that's a question that I'm left with and that I continue to wrestle with relative to my institutional positioning as an untenured teacher. So
that sounds similar to what we've heard from some of you about, early in my career, I'm in my student teaching, so I feel sort of vulnerable for different reasons. And in Brandon's defense, I think doing this type of work requires critical reflection, and critical reflection ain't easy, right? So really shining that reflective light inward is tough, and it makes us all uncomfortable. And the first time we do it, we want to sort of stiff arm it and fight that off. And I think that probably plays a role in how people have responded on Brandon's course evaluations, because I think that it looks very different than any teacher education experience they've probably had in the past. I valued what Brandon did so much that I do activism projects on all of my courses. Now the one where we did cohort e-portfolio, now it's a Writing as Activism class. So we're writing letters to the editor and getting them published. We're mailing off letter writing campaign stuff to legislators and corporations. And state superintendents, and any number of things that we think might help impact the education. So there's something there. And contextually, my students have not hammered me with those evaluations, but I can certainly understand how I might want to respond. The same way, part of that's just dumb luck, that they bought into it a little bit quicker. But we're still doing a lot of these things. We're just trying to wrestle with who we are and how that changes by semester.
So that identity piece is there, whether you've been teaching for less than a year or whether you've been teaching for years and years and years and years. And I think that's important for everybody to hear as we close tonight's session. Mike and Brandon, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for giving us some really good ideas for how we can engage our own students, whether they are younger or older, or whether we can engage ourselves actually in some of this work, which is really important as we develop our teacher identities. Brandon, I think you need to read the Inside Higher Ed article on teacher evaluations that just came out. Might make you feel a little bit better. And I also just kind of want to make the comment, since we're ending with this, that the high stakes nature of what we do as teacher, like whether it's a high stakes test that your students are taking and being evaluated on that goes into your SGO or your SGP or whatever it is, or a course evaluation that is being used to judge the quality of your teaching, like that, it does matter in who we are as a teacher, and it matters in our teacher identities. And the tensions that we feel with what are our students actually learning versus how are we or they performing, those are real tensions, and we feel them just like teachers in high school and middle school and elementary school classrooms feel them. So we get it, and these are things that we are constantly struggling with in our teacher identities. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. I will see a lot of you next week, and Mike and Brandon, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us. It's good to talk to you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.